Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her morning jog through the Royal Gardens would change her life forever. The 32-year-old marketing executive from London had always been passionate about fitness, and the beautiful grounds near Buckingham Palace provided the perfect backdrop for her daily runs. She had been taking this route for almost 2 years, always respectful of the boundaries and security protocols that surrounded the royal residence. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, Sarah was running slightly later than usual. She had overslept after working late the previous night on a crucial presentation for her advertising firm. The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she maintained her steady pace along the designated public pathway that ran parallel to the palace grounds. Her wireless earbuds played her favorite upbeat playlist, helping her maintain rhythm and motivation. As Sarah rounded a familiar corner, she noticed something unusual ahead. A small crowd of tourists had gathered near one of the security checkpoints. Their cameras and phones pointed toward the iconic red-uniformed guards. This was nothing new. Tourists always flocked to photograph the stoic sentries who stood motionless at their posts, maintaining the centuries-old tradition of protecting the royal family. However, what caught Sarah's attention was not the tourists, but rather a small, scrappy-looking terrier that had somehow wandered into the restricted area. The little dog, probably lost and confused, was barking frantically at one of the guards, seemingly trying to get his attention, or perhaps defending what it perceived as its territory. The guard, following strict protocol, remained absolutely still, his face expressionless beneath his tall black bearskin hat. Sarah slowed her pace, concerned for the animal's welfare. She could see that the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Security personnel were beginning to converge on the area, and the crowd of onlookers was growing larger. Some tourists were laughing and taking pictures, treating the incident as entertainment, while others seemed genuinely worried about the dog's safety. The terrier, a small brown and white mixed breed that looked well cared for despite being obviously lost, continued its frantic barking. It would dart toward the guard, then retreat, then approach again, its tail wagging uncertainly. Sarah recognized the signs of a frightened animal trying to make sense of an unfamiliar and overwhelming situation. What happened next would set in motion a series of events that neither Sarah nor anyone else present could have anticipated. As security guards began to close in on the small dog, attempting to safely remove it from the restricted area, the animal became increasingly panicked. In its desperation, it darted directly between the legs of the ceremonial guard, causing him to momentarily lose his balance. The guard, trained to maintain his position under almost any circumstances, tried to steady himself without breaking protocol. However, the unexpected movement caused him to take a small step backward, inadvertently stepping on the dog's paw. The terrier yelped in pain and fear, a sound that cut through the morning air and reached Sarah's ears even over her music. Without thinking, Sarah pulled out her earbuds and rushed toward the scene. Her maternal instincts, honed by years of caring for her own rescue animals, kicked in immediately. She could see that the dog was now limping slightly, though it didn't appear to be seriously injured. However, the animal's distress was evident, and the situation was escalating rapidly as more security personnel arrived on the scene. Sarah approached the edge of the restricted area, calling out to the security guards in an attempt to offer help. She explained that she had experience with frightened animals and might be able to safely coax the dog away from the ceremonial post. Her voice was calm and authoritative, the kind of tone that had served her well in high-pressure business meetings and now seemed appropriate for this unusual crisis. The security team, however, was focused on protocol and procedure rather than animal welfare. They were trained to handle human threats and security breaches, not scared pets. Their attempts to corner and capture the dog were well-intentioned, but clumsy, causing the terrier to become even more agitated and defensive. As Sarah watched the scene unfold, she made a decision that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Ignoring the barriers and the shouts from security personnel, she stepped into the restricted area, moving slowly and speaking in soothing tones to the frightened animal. Her years of volunteering at animal shelters had taught her how to approach scared dogs safely, and she was confident she could resolve the situation peacefully. The moment Sarah's foot crossed into the restricted zone, alarms began to sound, and the entire security apparatus of the palace shifted into high alert mode. The moment Sarah crossed the security perimeter, everything changed. What had been a manageable situation involving a lost dog suddenly transformed into a full-scale security incident. Armed police officers emerged from seemingly nowhere, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The ceremonial guard, still maintaining his position despite the chaos around him, watched as his colleagues moved to contain what they perceived as a potential threat. Sarah, focused entirely on reaching the injured terrier, barely registered the commotion she had caused. The dog had retreated to a corner near the guard post, whimpering and favoring its hurt paw. Her heart went out to the frightened animal, and she continued to speak in gentle, reassuring tones as she slowly approached. She had successfully used this technique countless times before, and she was confident it would work now. "Easy there, little one," she whispered, crouching down to make herself less threatening. "Nobody's going to hurt you, let's get you out of here." The terrier's ears perked up at her calm voice, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation might resolve peacefully. However, the security team had no way of knowing Sarah's intentions. From their perspective, an unidentified individual had breached a restricted area during what could potentially be a coordinated distraction. Their training kicked in immediately, and they moved to neutralize what they perceived as a threat to the royal family and the palace grounds. "Step away from the area immediately," shouted Sergeant James Harrison, the lead security officer. He was a 15-year veteran of palace security, a man who had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family and had never encountered a situation quite like this one. His commanding voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah looked up, startled by the aggressive tone. She raised one hand in a peaceful gesture while keeping the other extended toward the dog. "I'm just trying to help," she called back. "The dog is hurt. I can get him out of here safely." Her voice carried a note of urgency, born from her genuine concern for the animal's welfare. But Sergeant Harrison wasn't interested in explanations. His job was to secure the area and neutralize any potential threats. The crowd of tourists had grown substantially, with dozens of people now recording the incident on their phones. Social media was already beginning to buzz with speculation about what was happening at Buckingham Palace. "This is your final warning," Harrison announced, his hand moving to the equipment on his belt. "Exit the restricted area immediately or you will be forcibly removed." His tone left no room for negotiation, and Sarah finally began to understand the seriousness of her situation. The terrier, sensing the tension in the air, became agitated again. It began to bark frantically, not at the guards this time, but at the growing crowd of people surrounding the area. The poor animal was overwhelmed by the noise, the uniforms, and the general chaos that had erupted around what should have been a simple rescue operation. Sarah made a split-second decision that would have lasting consequences. Instead of immediately retreating as ordered, she lunged forward to grab the dog before it could injure itself further or escape deeper into the restricted area. Her movement was quick and unexpected, driven by pure instinct to protect a vulnerable animal. To the security team, however, Sarah's sudden movement looked like an aggressive action toward the ceremonial guard. Sergeant Harrison shouted an alert, and within seconds, 2 officers were moving to physically restrain her. The situation was spiraling out of control with frightening speed. As the first officer reached Sarah, she was cradling the trembling terrier in her arms. The dog, finally feeling safe, had stopped barking and was pressing against her chest. But Sarah's moment of triumph was short-lived. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, attempting to pull her away from the guard post. "Please, you're scaring him," Sarah protested, referring to the dog. But her words were lost in the commotion. The officer attempting to restrain her was focused on removing what he perceived as a security threat, not on animal welfare. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but those seconds would be replayed in news broadcasts and social media videos for weeks to come. As the officer tried to separate Sarah from the dog, she instinctively tightened her grip on the animal. The terrier, frightened by the sudden grabbing and pulling, began to struggle in her arms. In the confusion, Sarah lost her balance. She stumbled backward, still clutching the dog, and collided directly with the ceremonial guard who had been standing motionless throughout the entire incident. The impact was significant enough to cause both Sarah and the guard to stagger. It was at this moment that everything went wrong. The guard, trained never to abandon his post or lose his composure, tried to maintain his position even as Sarah fell against him. The collision was awkward and unexpected, and both individuals found themselves in an undignified tangle of limbs, ceremonial uniform, and one very confused terrier. As they fell, Sarah's arm struck the guard's face, and in her desperation to protect the dog and regain her balance, her mouth came into contact with the guard's hand. What happened next would become the subject of intense debate and investigation in the hours and days that followed. The collision between Sarah and the ceremonial guard happened so quickly that most witnesses didn't immediately understand what they had seen. The guard, 24-year-old Private Michael Thompson, was a dedicated soldier who had dreamed of serving in the prestigious Queen's Guard since he was a child. He had maintained his composure through thunderstorms, tourist provocations, and even a previous incident involving aggressive protesters. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. As Sarah fell against him, still desperately trying to protect the injured terrier in her arms, Private Thompson instinctively reached out to steady both her and himself. His white-gloved hand came up to break their fall, and in the chaos of the moment it ended up near Sarah's face. The sequence of events that followed would be dissected frame by frame in the coming days. But in the heat of the moment, everything happened in a blur of confusion and adrenaline. Sarah, off balance and frightened by the aggressive response of the security team, felt the guard's hand against her face. In her panicked state, with the terrier struggling in her arms and officers shouting orders around her, she reacted instinctively. Without conscious thought, her teeth clenched down on the guard's gloved hand. It wasn't a vicious attack or a calculated assault. It was the reflexive action of a frightened woman who felt cornered and threatened. The bite lasted only seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Private Thompson cried out in shock and pain, not so much from physical injury as from the complete unexpectedness of the situation. His pristine white glove was torn, and there were clear teeth marks visible on the fabric and slight indentations on his hand beneath. "She bit me," Thompson exclaimed, his military composure finally cracking. These were perhaps the first words he had spoken aloud during his guard duty, and they carried a mix of disbelief, pain, and professional embarrassment. The crowd of tourists gasped collectively, their cameras and phones capturing every moment of the unprecedented scene. Sarah immediately realized what she had done. The moment her teeth released the guard's hand, horror washed over her face. She had never bitten another human being in her adult life, and the gravity of her action hit her like a physical blow. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, still clutching the terrier. "I didn't mean to. I was trying to protect." But her apologies were drowned out by the immediate response of the security team. Sergeant Harrison was already calling for backup and medical assistance, his voice sharp with urgency. "We have an assault on a Queen's Guard," he reported into his radio, requesting immediate medical evaluation and additional units. The word assault sent shockwaves through the crowd. What had started as an amusing incident involving a lost dog had escalated into a serious criminal matter. The tourists who had been casually filming suddenly realized they might have captured evidence of a felony. Phones continued to record as the situation reached its climax. Private Thompson, despite his shock, tried to maintain some semblance of his professional demeanor. He stood at attention as best he could, though his torn glove and the obvious teeth marks made his composure seem almost surreal. Blood was visible on his hand, though the injury appeared to be relatively minor. Still, any assault on a member of the Queen's Guard was treated with the utmost seriousness. Sarah found herself surrounded by security officers, their attitudes now significantly more aggressive than before. The injured terrier in her arms sensed the increased tension and began to whimper again. Even in this moment of crisis, Sarah's primary concern remained the welfare of the small dog that had started this entire chain of events. "Please," she pleaded, with the officers as they moved to restrain her, "let me just put the dog down safely. He's hurt and scared." But her requests fell on deaf ears. The security team was now following protocol for dealing with an individual who had physically assaulted a member of the Royal Guard. As handcuffs were produced, Sarah gently set the terrier down on the ground. The small dog, finally free but still frightened, limped quickly away from the chaos and toward the crowd of onlookers. Several tourists tried to coax it toward them, but the animal was too traumatized to trust anyone at this point. The application of handcuffs marked a turning point in the incident. What had been a chaotic but potentially resolvable situation had now become a formal arrest. Sarah Mitchell, a law-abiding citizen who had never had so much as a parking ticket, found herself in custody for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. As the cold metal of the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. She thought about her job, her reputation, her family who would soon learn about this incident through news reports. The morning that had started with a simple jog had transformed into a nightmare that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Private Thompson, meanwhile, was being attended to by Palace medical staff who had arrived on the scene. They cleaned and examined his hand, documented the injury, and began the process that would be required for any assault case involving Palace security. Despite the relatively minor nature of his physical injury, the psychological impact of the incident was significant. The crowd of tourists continued to grow as word spread through social media about the unprecedented events unfolding at Buckingham Palace. Videos of the incident were already being uploaded to various platforms, each telling slightly different versions of the story depending on the angle and timing of the recording. Within minutes of Sarah's arrest, the incident had taken on a life of its own in the digital world. The videos captured by tourists were spreading across social media platforms faster than the Palace security team could have imagined. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok were flooded with clips showing different angles of the confrontation, each accompanied by sensationalized captions and wild speculation about what had really happened. The hashtag #JockPalaceAttack began trending within the first hour. Though many of the posts bore little resemblance to the actual events, some users claimed Sarah was a terrorist who had used the dog as a distraction. Others suggested she was a mentally unstable individual who had deliberately targeted the guard. The truth, that she had simply tried to help an injured animal, was lost in the noise of viral content and clickbait headlines. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in a holding cell at the local police station, still wearing her running clothes and trying to process the magnitude of her situation. The adrenaline that had carried her through the initial confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread about what lay ahead. She had been read her rights, fingerprinted and photographed, but the surreal nature of her circumstances made everything feel like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Detective Inspector Catherine Walsh was assigned to handle the case. A 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, she had dealt with everything from petty theft to international terrorism plots. However, she had never encountered a case quite like this one. The initial report described an unprovoked assault on a Queen's Guard. But as she began to review the available evidence, a more complex picture began to emerge. The first video Walsh examined showed Sarah's initial attempt to help the injured dog. Her actions appeared genuine and motivated by concern for the animal's welfare, rather than any malicious intent. However, the later footage clearly showed her biting Private Thompson's hand, an act that constituted assault regardless of the circumstances that led to it. "This is going to be a media circus," Walsh muttered to her colleague, Detective Sergeant Robert Chen, as they reviewed the evidence. The case had all the elements that the press loved: royalty, unusual circumstances, and dramatic video footage. They both knew that every decision they made would be scrutinized by the public and the media. Private Thompson had been taken to the Palace Medical Facility for a thorough examination. The bite had broken the skin in several places, though the injuries were not severe. More concerning to the medical staff was his emotional state. The young soldier was clearly shaken by the incident, and Palace officials were worried about the psychological impact on someone whose role required absolute composure and discipline. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," Thompson confided to the medical officer treating his wounds. "Maybe if I had moved when the dog first appeared, or if I had communicated somehow, but the medical officer reassured him that he had followed protocol correctly and that the incident was not his fault. Back at the police station, Sarah was finally allowed to make her phone call. With trembling fingers, she dialed her sister, Emma's number, praying that she would answer despite the early hour. Emma, a solicitor with a prestigious London firm, picked up on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "It's barely 9 in the morning," Emma said, immediately alert upon hearing the distress in her sister's voice. "Emma, I need your help," Sarah began, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm at the police station. I've been arrested for assaulting a Queen's Guard, and I don't know what to do." The words sounded impossible even as she spoke them. Emma sat up in bed, fully awake now. "What? Sarah, that's impossible. You wouldn't hurt a fly. Tell me exactly what happened." As Sarah recounted the morning's events, Emma's legal mind began working through the implications and potential defenses. "Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there," Emma instructed firmly. "I'm calling Marcus Hartwell. He's the best criminal defense attorney I know. We'll be there within the hour." Emma's professional composure helped calm Sarah's nerves, but both sisters understood that this situation was far more serious than a typical misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the story was beginning to attract attention from major news outlets. The BBC, Sky News, and various newspapers were sending reporters to the scene, eager to get fresh angles on what was being called the most unusual security incident at Buckingham Palace in recent memory. Palace officials were preparing their official statements, carefully balancing the need for transparency with their responsibility to protect the dignity of the royal institution. The injured terrier that had started the entire incident had been captured by animal control officers and taken to a nearby veterinary clinic. The dog, whose name turned out to be Charlie, belonged to an elderly tourist from Scotland who had been frantically searching for his escaped pet. When reunited with his owner, Charlie showed no lasting physical effects from his adventure, though he seemed more subdued than usual. Social media continued to buzz with conflicting accounts of the incident. Some users expressed sympathy for Sarah, arguing that she had been trying to help an injured animal and had reacted instinctively when confronted aggressively. Others insisted that there was no excuse for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard, regardless of the circumstances. The palace found itself in an unusual position of having to address a security incident that had been captured on video and shared millions of times before they could even complete their initial investigation. Press Secretary Amanda Whitfield was tasked with crafting a response that would satisfy public curiosity while maintaining the dignity expected of royal communications. The morning progressed. It became clear that this incident would have ramifications far beyond the immediate criminal charges Sarah faced. Questions were already being raised about palace security protocols, the training of ceremonial guards, and the procedures for handling incidents involving animals on royal property. Detective Inspector Walsh knew that her investigation would need to be thorough and impartial, despite the intense public interest and media pressure. The case was complicated by the emotional factors involved: Sarah's genuine concern for the dog, the guard's professional obligations, and the chaotic circumstances that had led to the unfortunate outcome. Marcus Hartwell arrived at the police station with the kind of commanding presence that had made him one of London's most sought-after criminal defense attorneys. In his 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind designer glasses, he had built his reputation defending high-profile clients in cases that seemed impossible to win. Emma had chosen well. If anyone could navigate the legal and public relations nightmare that Sarah now faced, it was Marcus. "Right," Marcus said after reviewing the initial police reports and video evidence. "This is certainly unique, but not insurmountable. The key will be establishing your state of mind and the circumstances that led to your actions." He spoke with calm authority, his confidence helping to ease some of Sarah's anxiety. The first challenge was dealing with the media frenzy that had erupted around the case. News vans were parked outside the police station, and reporters were already crafting sensationalized versions of the story. Marcus knew that winning in the court of public opinion would be almost as important as the legal proceedings themselves. "We, Need to get ahead of the narrative, he explained to Sarah and Emma. The videos show what happened, but they don't tell the whole story. People need to understand that you're a law-abiding citizen who acted out of compassion, not malice. He had already begun crafting a media strategy that would present Sarah in the most sympathetic light possible. Meanwhile, Private Thompson was struggling with his own challenges. The palace had granted him temporary leave while the investigation proceeded, but he was finding it difficult to cope with the unexpected notoriety. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from journalists, and he had been advised by his superiors to avoid making any public statements until the matter was resolved. The young soldier's family in Yorkshire had learned about the incident from television news reports rather than from Michael himself, adding to his distress. His mother, Patricia Thompson, was particularly upset by some of the more sensationalized media coverage, which portrayed her son as either a hapless victim or an overly rigid enforcer, depending on the outlet's perspective. He's such a gentle boy, Patricia told her neighbor, tears in her eyes as she watched yet another news report about the incident. He joined the army to serve his country, not to become a celebrity because some woman bit him. The unwanted attention was taking its toll on the entire Thompson family. Back at Scotland Yard, Detective Inspector Walsh was conducting a thorough investigation that went far beyond the simple assault charge. She interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed multiple video angles, and consulted with experts on crowd psychology and animal behavior. Her goal was to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened and whether criminal charges were truly appropriate. One of her most interesting discoveries came from interviewing Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a veterinarian who had treated Charlie the Terrier after the incident. The dog had a fractured toe and was clearly in significant pain, Dr. Hartley explained. Animals in distress can behave unpredictably, and their fear can be transmitted to humans who are trying to help them. This expert testimony would prove crucial in understanding Sarah's state of mind during the incident. Walsh was beginning to see a pattern of escalating stress and miscommunication that had led to an unfortunate outcome rather than a deliberate assault. The investigation also revealed that palace security protocols for handling animal-related incidents were outdated and incomplete. The guards had received extensive training for dealing with human threats, but very little guidance on managing situations involving animals. This oversight had contributed to the chaotic response that ultimately led to Sarah's desperate actions. As the days passed, public opinion began to shift slightly in Sarah's favor. Animal welfare groups rallied to her support, arguing that she had acted heroically to protect an injured creature. Social media campaigns with hashtags like #Justice for Sarah and Our Animal Hero began to compete with the more sensationalized coverage. However, the legal situation remained serious. The Crown Prosecution Service was under pressure to pursue charges, as any perceived leniency in cases involving royal security could set dangerous precedents. Sarah was facing potential jail time, substantial fines, and a criminal record that would destroy her career and reputation. The palace, meanwhile, was conducting its own internal review of the incident. Senior officials were embarrassed by the chaotic response and the negative publicity that had resulted. There were quiet discussions about whether changes needed to be made to security protocols and training procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Private Thompson's commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, was particularly concerned about the psychological impact on his young soldier. "Thompson is a good man and a dedicated guard," he confided to the palace security chief. "But this incident has shaken his confidence, and I'm not sure he'll ever feel the same about his role here." The colonel's assessment proved prescient when Thompson requested a meeting to discuss his future with the Guards Regiment. The young soldier was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the stoic composure required for ceremonial duties, especially when tourists would recognize him and attempt to provoke reactions by referencing the biting incident. As Sarah awaited the Crown Prosecution Service's decision on whether to proceed with charges, she found herself in a strange limbo. She had been suspended from her job, pending the outcome of the case, and the constant media attention made it impossible to maintain any semblance of normal life. Every trip to the grocery store or attempt to exercise became an exercise in avoiding photographers and reporters. The stress was taking its toll on her physical and mental health. She had always prided herself on being strong and independent, but the weight of potential criminal prosecution and public humiliation was becoming overwhelming. Only the support of her sister Emma and her legal team kept her from complete despair. The case had also sparked broader discussions about the role of ceremonial guards in modern Britain, the balance between security and public access to royal sites, and the treatment of animals in urban environments. Academic experts, security professionals, and animal welfare advocates all weighed in with opinions about what the incident revealed about British society and institutions. 3 weeks after the incident, the Crown Prosecution Service announced their decision in a packed courtroom that had attracted media attention from around the world. Sarah sat beside Marcus Hartwell, her hands trembling slightly as she waited to learn her fate. The past weeks of uncertainty had aged her considerably, and the stress was evident in her drawn features and the dark circles under her eyes. Chief Prosecutor Helena Morrison stood before the magistrate with a thick file of evidence and witness statements. Her decision would set a precedent for how similar cases might be handled in the future, and she was acutely aware of the scrutiny her announcement would receive. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet clicking of camera shutters from the media section. After careful consideration of all evidence and witness testimony, Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of her office. The Crown Prosecution Service has decided to pursue a charge of common assault against Ms. Sarah Mitchell. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt Emma's supportive hand squeeze her shoulder. However, Morrison continued, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, including Ms. Mitchell's previously unblemished record, her genuine concern for animal welfare, and the chaotic nature of the incident, we are prepared to accept a plea of guilty to a lesser charge of disturbing the peace, with a recommendation for community service rather than imprisonment. The offer was better than Sarah had dared to hope, but it still meant accepting a criminal conviction. Marcus had prepared her for this possibility, explaining that sometimes a pragmatic approach was better than risking a full trial that could result in much harsher consequences. Private Thompson was present in the courtroom, wearing his dress uniform but looking uncomfortable with the attention. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about the incident and had come to understand that Sarah's actions, while wrong, had not been motivated by malice. When called to provide his victim impact statement, he surprised everyone with his measured and compassionate response. I believe Ms. Mitchell acted out of concern for an injured animal, Thompson said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. While I cannot condone her actions, I understand that she was in a stressful situation and reacted instinctively. I hold no personal animosity toward her and hope that she can learn from this experience and move forward with her life. His statement drew murmurs of approval from the gallery, and even some of the more critical media outlets later praised his maturity and professionalism. The young guard's gracious response helped shift public opinion further in Sarah's favor, and demonstrated the kind of character that had made him suitable for his prestigious role. After consulting with Marcus, Sarah accepted the plea agreement. Standing before the magistrate, she formally pleaded guilty to disturbing the peace and expressed her sincere remorse for the incident. I deeply regret my actions and the distress I caused to Private Thompson and the security personnel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My only intention was to help an injured animal, but I understand that my behavior was inappropriate and cannot be excused. The magistrate Judge Eleanor Whitman sentenced Sarah to 120 hours of community service with animal welfare organizations, along with a fine of $2,000 and court costs. While it was still a criminal conviction, the sentence was widely viewed as fair and proportionate to the circumstances of the case. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Hartwell addressed the assembled media on Sarah's behalf. Ms. Mitchell is relieved that this matter has been resolved and looks forward to completing her community service, which will allow her to continue helping animals in a more appropriate setting, he stated. She remains deeply sorry for the distress caused to Private Thompson and respects his professionalism throughout this difficult period. The resolution of the case prompted several positive changes. The palace implemented new protocols for handling animal-related incidents, including specialized training for security personnel and clearer procedures for safely removing animals from restricted areas. A dedicated animal control officer was stationed at major royal sites during peak tourist hours. Private Thompson received counseling to help him process the psychological impact of the incident and eventually returned to full duties. However, he requested a transfer to a less public-facing role within the Guards regiment, feeling that the notoriety of the incident made it difficult for him to perform ceremonial duties effectively. Sarah completed her community service at several London animal shelters where her genuine compassion and dedication quickly won over staff and volunteers. The experience was therapeutic for her, allowing her to channel her love for animals in a constructive way while fulfilling her legal obligations. Many of her fellow volunteers were unaware of her notoriety, knowing her simply as a reliable and caring contributor to their cause. The incident led to lasting changes in how the palace and security services approached similar situations. Training programs were updated to include de-escalation techniques and protocols for managing incidents involving animals or distressed members of the public. The goal was to prevent the kind of rapid escalation that had turned a simple animal rescue into a criminal case. 6 months after the incident, Sarah was able to return to work at her advertising firm, though she kept a lower profile and avoided jogging near royal properties. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the importance of following proper procedures, even when motivated by good intentions. Charlie the terrier, whose injured paw had started the entire chain of events, made a full recovery and returned to Scotland with his owner. The elderly tourist, deeply grateful that someone had cared enough about his pet to risk their own welfare, sent Sarah a heartfelt letter of thanks and a photograph of Charlie playing happily in a Scottish meadow. The case became a subject of study in law schools and security training programs, used as an example of how quickly situations can escalate and the importance of clear communication and appropriate protocols. It also sparked ongoing discussions about the balance between security requirements and humanitarian concerns in public spaces. Years later, both Sarah and Private Thompson would look back on the incident as a defining moment that taught them important lessons about judgment, compassion, and the unintended consequences of split-second decisions. While neither would wish to relive the experience, both emerged from it as stronger and more thoughtful individuals, forever connected by a few chaotic minutes that changed both of their lives in ways they never could have imagined.